I'm Mo Blackwell, the host of Targeted, True Crime, Domestic Violence. We investigate cases of family violence each season using academic research to help us interpret the events so that we can become better advocates. In Season 1, we followed the case of little Militia Gibson, who was murdered by her stepfather as her mother stood by without intervening. We learned that Militia was not the only one being abused and took a hard look at laws and policies regarding abuse. In Season 2, we're telling the story of Tracy Thurman, who sued her city because police refused to protect her from her abusive husband. We'll also study the case of Joshua Osborne. His case was sensational, replete with the biker gang who rallied to protect Joshua, and new legislation resulting from his case. Josh passed away a few years ago, and two of his siblings agreed to tell his story. Except they've revealed it wasn't just Josh's story. It's their story too, one that has been suppressed for over a decade. You can find Targeted Podcast, True Crime, Domestic Violence on iTunes, Spotify, and all the major podcatchers. Peace, my friends. Peace.
On October 31st, 1984, San Jose was electric with children excited for an evening of tricks and especially treats. One of those families was the Herbarts, and in their neighborhood in North Valley, they, like many families, were planning a night of handing out candy and taking their little 4-year-old Deanna door to door. Doreen Erbert, Deanna's mother, was 8 months pregnant and unable to walk long distances. In fact, several of her friends had described the tiny, not quite 5-foot-tall woman as wide as she was tall. She stayed home to pass out candy, while her husband Charles took over the duties of walking in the chilly 56-degree evening around the neighborhood with Deanna. As the evening came to an end, Charles brought Deanna home, but had left a few houses nearby untricked and untreated so that Deanna could enjoy some time with her daughter on Halloween. After all, the entire family was just a month away from a new adventure, when the child Doreen was expecting would be born. Enjoying themselves and surrounded by happy neighbors, the family had no idea that something terrible laid in wait. A real-life monster, waiting to strike and waiting to change this family's future irrevocably in an event the police and newspapers would call a real-life Halloween horror. Unlike a horror movie, the terrible crime committed against this family is all too real, and the man responsible still sits on death row today and appealing his sentence. Welcome to this episode of California True Crime, the San Jose Halloween Murders. Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. Before we get started, I just want to give a disclaimer. The case we're covering tonight includes the death of a mother and her fetus. It's a very difficult topic. It's a brutal murder, and we will be giving details so that we can better talk about some of the legalities surrounding the crime, and some people may not want to listen to this. I'm Jessica, and I'll be your host for this episode. And for the first time, all 3 members of California True Crime are here to talk about this case. So first, welcome, Charles. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome, Jessica. I'm really excited for this.
And not last, or
not last, but certainly least.
No.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me, both of you. Before we get started, I want to let you know where I got the bulk of my information for this episode. I use legal papers, appeals papers, and newspapers. And just recently, I found an episode about this crime on the show Unmasked, which I'd never heard of before, on Discovery ID. It's from Season 1, Episode 3, if you want to go and find it. But this episode was already written, and when I watched the show, there were some things that were different. I've kept mainly everything the same. It's, like I said, come from our research, but I did add a few things here and there. The crime we're going to talk about tonight takes place in San Jose in 1984. San Jose is a city most listeners have probably heard of. So many influential things have happened here. And I actually did not realize it was the 3rd largest city in California. It has 1.35 million people in 2017. But perhaps most importantly, it's the largest city in Silicon Valley. And before there was Silicon Valley, there was agriculture in San Jose, as there was in basically most of California. Big-time agriculture had 1/3 of the world's prunes. But to save much of this history for other episodes and other crimes that happened during this time, those things really deserve their own episode. Silicon Valley probably denotes for most people cell phones and computers, but actually San Jose and the area around it was big on new and emerging technologies far before the tech boom. And Charles is here to give us a little history of Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley today has become the center of the software and internet industry for the world, but its roots go all the way back to the 1900s, when a student at Stanford University started the Federal Telegraph Company and began building more powerful transmitters that were capable of using Morse code and voice. Eventually, the U.S. Navy would use this technology and install it all over the world. At that same time, another Stanford student would start the College of Wireless and Engineering in San Jose and would launch the first regularly scheduled radio broadcast in the United States. It was here also that the Food Machinery Corporation, which was founded in Los Gatos, but moved to San Jose in 1903, and it was a company that the United States War Department contracted to build landing vehicle tracks, or LVTs. And these are the vehicles that made to carry troops and equipment over water and up onto beaches. Think the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, where the kind of tank boats were coming up onto Normandy Beach and the ramp was coming down. That's what they were making actually in San Jose. And this would lead to the area being on the forefront of military research and development for military vehicles like the Bradley fighting tank and the M1 Abrams tank. And this is also going to cause a close relationship in the area with the United States military in general. In 1943, IBM will establish our West Coast headquarters in San Jose. In 1952, they opened a research and development facility in downtown, where Reynold Johnson and his team invented the RAMAC. This stands for Random Access Method of Accounting and Control. In 1956, IBM also opens its Cottle Road manufacturing facility in the Santa Teresa neighborhood, and this is where disk drives were invented in 1962. During the 80s, when our case takes place, Silicon Valley isn't just a technology center, but it's also manufacturing as well. For the most part, the large companies making technology during this time are also manufacturing it right there in San Jose. So there are a lot of people working in the manufacturing industry, as well as the software development. This is also the reason that a lot of larger buildings in Silicon Valley are built on the remains of manufacturing plants. And we should be clear that San Jose has a huge and diverse history, and we're not covering that in this episode as it doesn't really intersect with this case, but we will definitely be back and want to save as much of that history for those stories in the future. But San Jose's history is much bigger than Silicon Valley and tech history that most people will think of today. And aside from Silicon Valley, there's also some famous people. Some famous Californians are from San Jose. So a few of the more notable ones, Adrienne Barbeau, which if you're not familiar with Adrienne Barbeau, she was made famous in a lot of John Carpenter movies from the 70s and 80s. Dustin Diamond, who was a big part of a lot of our childhoods with Saved by the Bell. Also the Smothers Brothers, which are you guys familiar with the Smothers Brothers?
Yeah.
Okay. And which I thought was weird. I thought this next person really kind of blew me away. A person by the name of Crazy George Henderson, who is known as a cheerleader, but he's actually the guy who invented the wave. He's from San Jose.
Like the dance?
Yeah, like what you do at like sporting events where everyone jumps up and throws their hands in the air. Also, and then like we said earlier with the Silicon Valley, you have native Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak of Apple fame, as well as the founder of Bank of America, and Jerry Yang, who's the co-founder of Yahoo, are all from San Jose.
You left out also the hot dog eating champion, Joey Chestnut.
That's right, who brought home the mustard yellow belt to America from the Japanese, I believe his name was Kobayashi?
Yes,
right.
That's going back.
Right. And also there's a huge, quite a few musicians and bands from San Jose. Most notably, the Doobie Brothers, some members of Fleetwood Mac, Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue, and Stone Temple Pilots. A few members of Stone Temple Pilots.
I found some things interesting also. San Jose is considered one of the safest cities in the country, but it is also one of the most expensive, with rent being around $1,750, and to buy a home, it's roughly $750,000. But then going with safety and the high prices, it also has one of the highest homeless populations in the country. And I thought that was very interesting with just talk of homeless and safety nowadays. You have one of the safest, but also one of the highest homeless populations. Another thing that I found very interesting was from roadsideamerica.com. If you are traveling northbound on the 101 and right at the exit ramp to Tully Road, there is a world famous statue because it's the tallest rat statue ever made of 30 feet. And all it is a giant Chuck E. Cheese inside like a cage. And it's lit up at night if you ever want to see it. I mean, you can see it in the day too.
Like the rat at the pizza parlor,
Yeah.
Chuck E. Cheese in a cage?
Well, it looks like a cage and it's like lit up. But it was actually the guys, like, it took 6 months to build. It was early 80s that it was made, and he was like a starving artist. This is just what I read. He was a starving artist, and he went to Chuck E. Cheese. I don't know why. Oh, I'm a starving artist. Let me go to Chuck E. Cheese and see if they have work. And they said, can you build like a giant rat? And he did.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So San Jose is very large, as we said. It has things like San Jose State there, the college. I've never lived there. It's one of the few places we've talked about so far I've never really spent much time in. So I talked with a good friend of mine who did live there. And I just wanted to quickly mention a local thing, which I guess is the statue. I guess it's the statue of Quetzalcoatl.
Quetzalcoatl?
And I guess locals call it the poo snake because, and you can look this up, it really does look like a dog left something there. And it has a whole history. It's actually was created by artist Robert Graham in 94 when the city paid him to create something that would honor the founding of San Jose and its Hispanic founders. Legend goes that when they discarded 3 of his favorite ideas for the statue, he created this one and called it Park God, which backwards is dog crap, as revenge for the other 3 statues. But either way, I guess when you're in town, you might say, meet me at the poo statue or poop statue or whatever you want to call it. I just thought I'd mention that. This crime takes place in a San Jose neighborhood called Berryessa. At least that's what it's called on maps. I'm told locally it's called North Valley. This area is northwest San Jose, and the particular neighborhood is very close to Interstate 680. I believe the house the crime occurs in backs up basically directly so that 680 runs right behind it. Interstate 680 doesn't travel the length of California. It mainly runs through the Bay Area in places like San Jose, Oakland, San Ramon. And it was only given the title of interstate in 1955, and much of the places you exit or meets up with other things were completed during the 60s, which is just interesting to me because most of the things in California we talk about have been here for a long time. I always just think of them as old, and this is kind of relatively brand new for California history.
Right.
In fact, the house sits to the east of the interstate, and if you follow the road the Erberts live in 1984, it leads to a pedestrian bridge that crosses directly over I-680 and into other neighborhoods. It's that close to the interstate. The neighborhood in North Valley had only been around for a little over 10 years in 1984. Like much of California, it had been farmland and orchards prior to be bought up and sold to developers who built homes. California has been in the midst of a large population explosion just in general, and San Jose is experiencing this in the 70s. If you remember our episode on Michael Rittenauer, we talked a lot about population explosion in Modesto, and that's basically happening almost everywhere in California, just to a much smaller extent. In 1970, the population of San Jose is 445,779, and by 1980, it'll be 629,442, and it just keeps increasing. So building houses is a booming industry in most areas of California, and a lot of people living in this area are people working in different capacities in the 70s and 80s in technology or manufacturing. It's a very highly populated suburban area. Doreen and Charles Erbert have been married since 1979. They met when her car broke down and Charles stopped to help her. They hit it off. Doreen had worked as a physical therapist, but after they marry, she joins him in his successful carpet business. Charles was Doreen's second husband. She had been married for several years to another man named William Michael Dennis, but the 2 of them had divorced in 1978. This divorce was a difficult one for Doreen. Her and William Dennis shared a son together. His name was Paul, and I believe when the 2 divorced in 1978, he was only about 1 year old. The divorce between the 2 was very bitter and angry, and they fought for custody of their son. There were hard feelings on both sides when Doreen received custody of Paul from the court. I will say that the show Unmasked made it seem as if they had an amicable divorce, when nothing I read indicated anything of the sort. Although it's possible it may be a situation where one person thought it was amicable and another was very angry about it. And for this case, I do want to warn people there may be some differences from that episode. We're going to stick with what we researched, but just to kind of warn you if you watch that episode. And their divorce is one of those instances that's different. Most of it's the same. As I said, Doreen remarried to Charles Herbart in 1979, and Paul came to live with them in a house in the North Valley area of San Jose. The house sat among many others in a suburban area, and lined up behind the home, as we talked about, was I-680. Just down the street was a pedestrian bridge that if you walked over, you would be instantly in the neighborhood where her husband, William Michael Dennis, lived. He often went by the name Mike or Michael. In all, it was about a 6 to 10 minute walk, or 6 blocks between the two homes, and even though Doreen had full custody of their son Paul, William Dennis had visitation rights and would pick up his son for visits or when he would stay with him.
The house that Michael lives in right now, is that the house that they lived in together when they were married?
No, and I actually don't know where they lived when they lived together.
So they both moved out and then ended up blocks away from each other.
Yeah, he lives in a 2-story house, and I know he lives with his mom. I don't think it's her house, but she lives in a separate apartment, I think, somehow. So it's separated. I don't know if it's just on the same property or if it's physically part of the same house. And when she married Charles, she moved into the house he was living in. Oh, okay.
So Charles already lived there. And do you know if Michael and his mom moved in after she moved in?
I don't know. Okay. Yeah. This same year, Doreen and Charles would welcome a baby girl into their family. On November 26, 1979, Deanna Herbart was born, and she would come home to live with her older brother, Paul. But the happiness was not to last, when in 1980, something every parent dreads happened to the family. Doreen's son Paul was found drowned in the family's backyard pool. Labeled a terrible accident by authorities, this horrible event changed the family forever. Paul was only 3 years old at the time. While impossible to know how to deal with this situation, Doreen's ex-husband lashed out at the family and blamed them for his son's death. William Dennis came to believe that his son's death was not an accident, but the result of negligence on the part of Doreen and Charles Herbart. Despite neighbors who said otherwise, William Dennis felt that Doreen hadn't been paying enough attention to Paul and that she hadn't jumped into the pool to save him. A neighbor testified specifically about Doreen's efforts to rescue Paul. We don't really have transcripts, so I'm not sure what efforts includes. But that's what they testified to. According to Doreen, Paul was outside playing, and she was watching him while taking care of Deanna inside. She looked away for 1 second and then couldn't find him. She went next door to look for him and asked a neighbor for help, and that's when they found him in the bottom of the pool. He was found too late to revive. And I can't imagine going through any of this, but in this case it seems William Dennis's grief, coupled with his anger over the divorce and custody being awarded to Doreen, just sort of manifested in really unhealthy ways. It caused even more explosive and unhealthy ideas. For instance, he began to believe that Doreen just didn't seem sad enough about their son's death, and it's just a lot to go through. I looked up the 5 stages of grief, or denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and he sort of seems to live in the anger phase. And I know we've talked about this in different episodes, though, is kind of looking at someone and knowing how they're feeling or how they've reacted.
Yeah, it's often seen as people will say, oh, that person didn't grieve the right way, so they obviously must be guilty. And I can see if somebody like William Michael is, as a grieving father, and losing his wife, or what he saw as, or whether he saw it as his failure, or however he was feeling with his wife, marriage breaking up. But then on top of which, seeing her with a new person, and them having a new kid, and his son dies, and if she's doesn't appear to be grieving the right way and already feeling anger, it's just going to feed into it.
I feel if you watch a lot of these TV shows of, you'll see a police interview right away, and everyone becomes the jury of how they're grieving. They're not grieving correctly or anything like that. And you can't really ever tell. I think we've all been in our own situations where we might have grieved properly to people's eyes and then maybe not. And it's not our decision to make anyway. It's how you want to grieve.
Right.
And I mean, I think it's really hard just to go through this. He continues to do things like deposit money into his son's savings account.
Which is odd grief right there, I think. I mean, if someone sees that, isn't that a little...
Yeah, but isn't that kind of like you hear stories of people that have lost loved ones that never change anything in their room or continue to drive the person's car or have a constant reminder of that person there.
Someone might say that's strange.
You're right.
They're not grieving correct.
Right.
I think any little thing shows that you can't tell how anyone is grieving correctly.
Right.
And it's probably made worse by the fact that you're also grieving. You might not be able to see other people as clearly through all of that pain.
Right.
William Dennis decides to sue his ex-wife and her husband after the death of his son for negligence. A basic legal definition of negligence in California, and a quick reminder for those out there, we are not lawyers. We're going to talk a lot about laws in this episode, so just remember that. It's called gross negligence in California, or a lack of care. Everyone in California is expected to show a certain amount of care with respect to others around us. The definition of gross negligence is a lack of any care. Someone has to exhibit such an extreme departure of what someone in their same position would exhibit. A lack of care in respect to the prevention of harm. In the suit, he again accused Doreen of causing the accident by not paying attention and said that he had worried for some time that this might happen to Paul. He believed the pool to be very dangerous. According to him, he had asked her to put a fence around the pool as evidence that she was negligent. She had actually put a fence around the pool, however. A parent looking away for a second is not uncommon. A jury sided with the Herberts, and after the trial, Charles Herbart told William Dennis that he never wanted him to come to the house again. Basically, they never wanted to see him again, which is kind of understandable. To lose your child and then go through being sued must be very difficult. And there were other things as well, things that are difficult under the best of circumstances, and everyone's getting along. Things like funeral costs and splitting those up, and outstanding child support payments. Things not meant to harm anyone further, but they come up and you have to deal with them, and they kind of made him very angry. Despite the fact that the three lived close to each other, they only saw each other once through the years when they were at the same shopping center. According to Charles, they didn't speak and they didn't see each other again. Unfortunately, this lack of seeing each other didn't seem to lessen any anger on William Michael Dennis's part. The years continued to make him even angrier at Doreen. He continued to blame her for the death of his son, and according to him and people that knew him, his anger blossomed into fantastical ideas of what happened to his son. He believed Doreen had lied at the trial over negligence. At some point, he thought it might be possible that she had let him die purposefully. He was so angry and unable to deal with the loss of his son, and began to think that Doreen needed to suffer. She needed to know what it feels like to be him and also to be Paul. After Paul's death, Michael Dennis did receive counseling, and he reported that it helped him. He reported to the doctor or facility that it helped, and he eventually stopped. Then in 1984, William Dennis was laid off from his job at Lockheed. Lockheed refers to Lockheed Missiles and Space Program. It was located in Sunnyvale, California. Sunnyvale is about 12 miles west of San Jose. Lockheed was a manufacturing plant that developed satellites. It was near Moffett Field, which was a military air base, and is now both military and civilian. Lockheed would eventually become Lockheed Martin, when it merges with Martin Marietta in 1995. At Lockheed, William Dennis worked as a sprayer of manufactured tiles that were then used on space shuttles. He's given the choice of, instead of losing his job altogether, he could move to a lower job. He does do this. This new job was a downgrade from what he was doing. He joined the document production unit, and it's not just a demotion in title, but also in pay. He had been making $13.55 an hour in his prior position, and now only makes $10.99 an hour. And just to give you kind of an idea, minimum wage in California in 1984 is $3.35 an hour. William Dennis's salary is $28,000 a year, and median income in California in 1980 was $18,000. So although it's more expensive to live in San Jose, this is kind of it's not as low as it sounds.
Right. And I bet just minimum wage jobs in general probably aren't that big in San Jose. I mean, if it's that expensive to live there, you're probably getting paid more. Like in certain areas of California, you still make more than minimum wage, even though minimum wage is there.
And so $28,000 a year in 2018 is roughly about $68,000. So if you look at comparable cities in the area in Silicon Valley, and he's working at that time for a government contractor, probably at one time that would be an okay middle class living. But we're starting to move into that area, like you said, where we have a lot of higher end jobs and a lot of lower paying wage jobs. And I think that slice of that middle class is getting smaller and smaller.
Like most people, he was very unhappy with this demotion and made it known to many people. But it was more stress and anger to add to his already consuming anger with his ex-wife, which all came to a crashing end in 1984. October 31st, 1984, was another Halloween night for most families in San Jose who were getting dressed up, trick-or-treating, getting ready for parties, planning time with friends, neighbors, and loved ones. It was a chilly 56 degrees that night, and while many people found themselves at parties or in the movie theater watching October's big movie The Terminator or the cult classic Body Double, many families bundled up together in an effort to fill bags with pounds of candy. The biggest fear for many people that night was some terrible person might poison or stick a razor blade in their child's candy or apple, which reminded me of trick-or-treating in the 80s, and after at least once we went and had candy x-rayed at the hospital. I don't know if you guys did that.
I never did, but I always heard about it.
No, I didn't either.
And apparently this idea of people getting poisoned or razor bladed is basically a myth because it's so rare. In 1983, Abigail Van Buren, or Dear Abby, as you might know her, wrote an advice column about Halloween, warning parents that at least one child would become ill with poison candy or an apple with a razor blade. And the fear took off. 10 years later, her sister Ann Landers would write an advice column warning of the same thing, and the fear would continue. There was a man who poisoned his son's Halloween candy, but apparently there isn't a case of a stranger poisoning random kids' candy. So I think the lesson here is be afraid of the people you know. Although in San Jose, and especially in the neighborhoods the Erberts lived in, there was an added fear. In the months leading up to the Halloween, there had been 2 murders of 2 women that set people on edge. They were brutal murders of their own. The first happened in August, when a bank worker named Tanya Zach went missing. She wouldn't be found until September of 1984, in a strange instance where a psychic contacted the family and led them to the spot where she was left. She had been beaten to death with a ball-peen hammer and thrown down a hill near a reservoir. This murder wouldn't be solved until 1989. The other was the murder of Lori Lee Miller, who went missing on September 26th. A bicyclist found her body in the beginning of October. She had been tied up and strangled. And in the process of looking for her, searchers would find 2 other corpses. One a woman and one a man, not connected. Miller's murder would be tied to a horrible serial murder later in the month. Fernando Cota would be caught in Milpitas, California in October. He would have another woman in his van that he had murdered. He would commit suicide. These are just a few of the things happening in San Jose at the time, so it makes sense that it might frighten people. I know we talked about this in a couple of other episodes where things are already going on. People are a little on edge, maybe even a little more careful.
Right.
More aware of their surroundings. And Charles Herbart would later tell police that Doreen had been afraid. She had been getting threatening phone calls and had an encounter with someone on the street she believed later tried to break into their house. So just some very scary things. After work, Charles Herbart came home to take his 3-year-old Deanna trick-or-treating. His wife Doreen was 8 months pregnant and unable to walk comfortably long distances. She would stay home and pass out candy to trick-or-treaters. Doreen had tried for some time to get pregnant and had suffered miscarriages that had taken a toll. Of importance was making sure she did everything to keep the little boy, who was just a month away from joining the family, safe. She had also grown quite big. Doreen wasn't very tall. She was shorter than 5 feet tall, and people who knew her would remark that she was out as far as she was high. This made getting around even more difficult. The sun began to go down in San Jose that night at 5:11 p.m., which means it wouldn't be dark until about 6 or 6:30 or so, and kids all around the city began to get excited. Around this time, Charles took Deanna out trick-or-treating, and Doreen stayed behind handing out candy. Several neighbors stopped by the house that night with their children. They remember Doreen handing out candy, very visibly pregnant. Neighbors also noticed someone across the street, someone they didn't know, although making an identification would be hard. While Charles was walking Deanna house to house collecting candy, neighbors noticed a man standing across the street from the Herbart house, in costume and mask, and seemingly staring at the house intently. Between 6:30 and 7 p.m., several neighbors knocked on the Herbart door for candy, and were able to describe the man across the street as dressed as a wolf. The wolf mask the man wore was not a serious one meant to instill fear. Instead, it was a much more cartoony mask, with a long tongue hanging out and bulging eyes. It was often referred to as a, quote, big bad wolf mask. I have a very Looney Tunes idea in my head of what this mask must look like. We will put a picture we have from the episode of Unmasked on our site and on social media. The man behind the mask, however, remained unknown. Between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., Charles and Deanna returned home. They had done a lot of trick-or-treating, but Charles had purposely not gone to a few houses nearest them so Doreen could experience Halloween with their daughter. The two switched places, Charles handing out candy and Doreen taking Deanna to knock on a few more houses. Around 8 p.m., Doreen and Deanna returned home tired and done for the night. The family had given out most of their candy that night and were running low. Charles decided to make a quick trip to a local liquor store about 15 minutes away to refill their supplies. He left at 8:45. He also stopped by a neighbor's house on the way. They were having a party. As he left, he asked Doreen to begin locking up the house as it was getting very late.
Was Halloween this time, is it on a Saturday or a Friday?
No, it was actually on a Wednesday this year.
Oh, okay. I just find that weird, like, if there's parties. I guess it's probably an early party, but still.
Well, I can see that it too, especially in neighborhood. I know growing up where I had relatives that lived in an area that was really heavily trafficked for trick-or-treaters that would come down. So we would all congregate there, and the adults would have dinner and have a drink, and then the kids would all go out and we'd walk around the neighborhoods and kind of come back and forth. So, and that might have been in the middle of the week, and we are talking about 8 o'clock, so I can see it.
Yeah, it's not really late. So.
Right, and it's difference between a rager and then having a few friends over.
Yeah.
After he left, a knock came at the Herbert's front door. Assuming another trick-or-treater was there for candy, Doreen answered the door. But the person outside was not a child and not there for candy. Pushing his way inside the front entrance of the house, the man in the wolf mask began to yell. Doreen immediately told the man to get out of my house. In reply, the masked man yelled back, "I'm going to kill you." Quickly thinking, Doreen yelled for her child, Deanna, to hide, and the 3-year-old followed her mother's instructions as quickly as she could. She hid behind a living room couch and overheard everything that happened next. Later, the only witness to her mother's murder, she would be unable to recall many details. Whether she never peeked out at the scene or trauma made those memories difficult to recall is hard to say. After all, she was very little, and what happened to her mother was very terrible. She does recall hearing the events, and what she does remember is that she left her hiding place only twice. Once to take a peek at what was happening, and another time to rush to get her comforting blanket. She stayed, as her mother told her, hidden. It would take some time to fully piece together what happened to Doreen that night, but it was horrific. Sometime after the man pushed his way into the house, he pulled out an 18-inch machete and began attacking Doreen. Doreen was never able to get farther than the entrance near the front door, which led directly into the living room. The exact cause of death was exsanguination from multiple chopping wounds, but even this terrible cause does not describe fully how horribly Doreen was treated.
Before we go any further, we just want to reiterate that we're going to be getting into the graphic nature of the crime right now. So if anyone does not want to listen at the moment, or we just want to warn you.
The weapon the murderer used was unrelenting and caused many wounds. The man in the mask used the weapon in slashing, chopping, and stabbing motions. Doreen suffered cuts to the front and back of her head, some so deep they penetrated her skull and into the brain. Her left hand was completely severed above the wrist. Many of the wounds she suffered around her body cut all the way to the bone. One severed the head of the humerus, while another fractured her femur. On her right breast, she suffered 3 stabbing wounds. Sometime during the attack, the man wearing the wolf mask ripped off his mask and threw it into the entryway. Police believe the man beneath the mask wanted her to know who he was. But his violence was not done yet. The man slashed a 9-inch gaping wound to Doreen's abdomen. This, along with several other chopping cuts, caused her abdomen to open. Both her stomach and large bowel were cut open. There were also cuts to her uterus and an 18-inch cut that went all the way through it. At some point, either by the assailant pulling him out or by being expelled by all the violence, Doreen's fetus was expelled. The masked man's anger wasn't just aimed at Doreen. We won't get into detail here, but her baby boy was treated very similarly to her. One of the cuts he suffered ended his life. This cut would have been enough to stop his heart and circulation. When the fetus is autopsied, no air is found in its lungs. Police do not think it ever breathed or lived independently of Doreen, either due to its or her injuries. However, if she had given birth on Halloween, it would have been capable of living outside the mother. The man then walked through the house looking for Deanna, yelling out her name and threatening her. Deanna did not move from her hiding spot behind the couch, and after what must have felt like an eternity, the man finally left the house. Near to 9 p.m., Charles Herbart returned home from the store. When he approached the house, he noticed that the front door was unlocked. This was unexpected because he had talked with Doreen about locking the house up before he left. As he opened the door, what he saw was worse than he could have imagined. The first thing he saw was Doreen, lying on the floor at the edge of the entryway and the living room. She was covered in blood. In the living room, he could see a fetus on the floor, and the first thing that jumped into his mind was that she might have miscarried while he was gone. But this was a short-lived thought, as he saw near the fetus was Doreen's left hand, separated from her body. Quickly moving to her side, he grabbed her arm and began to hold it tightly near the wrist where it had been severed. It was gushing blood, and Charles's first instinct was to try to stop the bleeding. As he did so, he started to notice cuts on her neck and stomach. Letting go of her arm, he ran to the telephone. The area had become saturated in Doreen's blood, and as he moved to the telephone, he slipped and fell in a puddle of blood, getting blood all over him in the process. Picking up the phone, he tried desperately to call 911. Inside the receiver, all he got was a busy signal. He couldn't get through. Panicked, he called the fire department directly. Someone on the end of this call picked up, and they were able to put a call out to the police and ambulance. His next phone call was to a neighbor. He needed someone to help. Anyone. At the end of this phone call, he glances at the couch and sees his daughter. Deanna was hiding behind it. Immediately, he grabbed her and put her in the kitchen, thinking he might be able to shield her from having to see anything else. He then rushed back to Doreen. Doreen was in terrible shape, but she had not yet died. Trying desperately, Charles attempted to stop any bleeding he could. Arriving at the house, the neighbor held on to Deanna and kept her from going into the living room. Eventually, she would take her outside. This neighbor would say that Deanna told her Doreen at one point yelled out the name Michael. She also told her neighbor that the man in the wolf mask had threatened to kill her if she told anyone. At some point in the night, she also said that while hiding during the attack, she heard her mother and the baby crying. Between 9 to 9:15, the fire department and the paramedics arrived at the Herbart home. Immediately, they take stock of the scene, but some things are difficult to understand. Paramedics begin to work on Doreen, and she still has a pulse, so they know they need to get her to the hospital. They load her onto a stretcher and begin to put her in the ambulance. In shock and desperation, Charles tries to assist the paramedics in any way he can. As soon as she's loaded into the ambulance, his first instinct, as it would be many of us, was to get in with her. He didn't want to leave her side. But paramedics wouldn't allow him into the ambulance, and when Charles becomes upset, the police arrest him and put him into a car outside his house. Police say he was erratic and had alcohol in his breath, which makes complete sense to me that he would be upset and erratic. I don't know, what do you guys think?
For me, I can completely understand him being erratic or needing to be restrained. I mean, this is he leaves at 8:45 and he gets back at around 9 o'clock. So in less than 15 minutes, his entire world is destroyed, and on top of which, I can only imagine from a police perspective, you show up, here's somebody who's covered in blood. As a police, I think my first response would go, he's guilty.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably why he didn't get in. They're just making sure the safety of everyone else, and right. I can understand his point of view. I can understand the other people's point of view. You don't know. You have like an active situation going on. The whole situation is horrible, and I don't know what you could have done. Everyone's making reactions right as they come.
And the idea that he does, I mean, you did mention that he had, the police report, he's got alcohol in his breath. Again, probably from stopping over at his friend's house.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think you make a great point of that. Keeping everyone safe is their first priority.
Deanna, meanwhile, is put into a neighbor's car outside. Trying to keep her from the scene and protect her as much as possible becomes their job. While police begin to look through the house and try to put together the horrible scene, Charles is left in a police cruiser outside. By the second, he grows angrier. By the time Doreen arrives at the hospital, she is pronounced dead. Charles never gets to the hospital to see her. The job of police is now to piece together what happened. When police reservist Glenn Sefton arrived on the scene, what he sees is astounding. The scene is very bloody and chaotic. Neighbors, fire, paramedics are moving in and out of the crime scene. Doreen has been loaded up to the hospital, and paramedics on scene are trying everything to resuscitate the fetus. Unfortunately, its injuries are far too gone. Police search the house for any sign of a perpetrator. Without much information to go on, they need to make sure there isn't anyone still in the house. They find nothing, but they do shut down the scene to preserve any evidence. The scene is bloody, but seems mainly kept to the area of the entryway and the living room. Everything else seems to be blood tracked in by people moving through the crime scene. Upon entering the house, there is blood spatter on the entryway, a stool near the front door, a jack-o'-lantern, the front door, and on the ceiling. Later, it will be determined that this blood spatter was in fact velocity blood stains. Stains from blood that flew off the weapon as it was used over and over to strike her. There are also slash marks on the front door and on the 8-foot ceiling above the entryway. Unsure exactly what caused these marks and the wounds to Doreen, police believe it was a heavy, sharp, sword-like instrument, perhaps a meat cleaver. In the front porch area, a wolf mask is found in a corner. Police on scene are able to determine it does not belong to any of the Erberts. Late into the night, the police continue working the scene. This was a murder that was hyper-violent and personal. This with Charles's behavior leads them to continue to suspect he may have done this. He is taken to a police station to answer questions. He is strip searched and his clothes are collected. Police also talk with Deanna, and their interview confirms their suspicions that someone the family knew may have committed the crime. While interviewing neighbors, someone tells them that Doreen had been married before, and things had been tense, and they look into this. And I just think it's kind of interesting because in other cases we sometimes see police having, tunnel vision. It would be easy here to think Charles did this and not really think about other suspects.
Right. We have somebody covered in blood, acting erratic.
That probably was the initial thought, and that's why he was in the police cruiser. But I think with anything, you have to look at everything. Hopefully, and I understand the whole tunnel vision thing, but I think that like documentaries you see nowadays, it seems like they try to put them one-sided on tunnel vision. But I think if, your police detective or police work is good, they have to think of everything.
Right.
Police also find drops of blood outside the home on the sidewalk. These create a trail, and they follow it to the end of the street. The trail goes to the pedestrian bridge and then continues on it. At the other side of the bridge, they stop, leading police to think that someone may have gotten into a vehicle at that point. Witnesses come forward to say that during the night, they saw a man with a wolf mask walk over the bridge. The person was wearing coveralls and carrying a bag that appeared to be heavy. Eventually, they come to the conclusion that Charles didn't commit this crime, though I think he was in police custody for about a day. They were able to narrow down his alibi. However quickly they figured out he didn't do it wasn't really quickly enough, at least not for Charles. He wasn't able to ride with Doreen to the hospital, and sitting in the back of a police cruiser while his wife and daughter suffered was difficult to swallow. With some information, a possible suspect appeared to be Doreen's ex-husband, William Michael Dennis, who often went by Michael. And at 12:23 a.m., they arrive at his 2-story house just 6 blocks or so from the crime scene to tell him what had happened and question him about his whereabouts. Arriving at his house, police rang the doorbell to his home and no one answered. Upstairs, police could see a light on in what appeared to be his bedroom. They tried several more times, but no one came to the door. Police decided to call county communications. They asked them to call the house and let whoever is inside know they are downstairs and ask them to open the door, which just made me think a lot about cell phones, how different things are in this story.
Just a short amount of time, how that one device has changed how you would do your job.
They do so, and then they call William Michael Dennis picks up the phone. Once the call ended, police outside the house can see a light in the bedroom go off and what appears to be a hallway light go on. Then they hear the sound of running water for a few minutes inside the house. After a few minutes, William Michael Dennis answers the door and tries to give the impression to police that he had been sleeping, but police outside are immediately suspicious as he doesn't look like someone who had been dead asleep and couldn't hear the doorbell. Police inform William Michael Dennis that his ex-wife was attacked in her home, and they inquired as to if he had any information on the crime. They also asked him if they could come inside his house to talk. Without any issue, he lets them inside his home. Once inside, the police and William sit down at a kitchen table. Police inform him that not only has Doreen been attacked, but that she has been murdered. William Dennis's reply was simple. He said, quote, "You're kidding." While talking with William Dennis, the police noticed that he had cuts on his right hand. The cuts were bandaged but appeared deep because they were still bleeding and the bandages were soaked with blood. police continued talking with William Dennis and at some point asked to see his identification. William didn't have his ID in his kitchen, but told police it was upstairs in his bedroom, and he had to go get it. Police let him walk upstairs to get his ID, but sent a police officer with him to watch him. When they entered his bedroom, the officer noticed that the bed did not look as if anyone had been sleeping in it. While upstairs, William Dennis seemed to become irritated, and as the police officer watched him, he noticed that he kept looking over at his bed, specifically the headboard. Later, when police search the home, they find a loaded revolver near the headboard. After getting his ID, police ask for permission to search his home, and William Dennis gives them permission. As police start to search, they find many things right away that lead them to believe that William Dennis is very much involved. In his garage, they find drops of blood in front of a washer and dryer. Officers follow this blood, and it leads to a larger trail of blood outside the garage. They also find blood in the kitchen, on a pair of jeans lying on his bed, on a set of keys also in his bedroom, and more bloody bandages in a garbage in his bathroom. At this time, police arrest William Dennis and go about securing the house to preserve any possible evidence, and go about a more thorough search of the house. During this, they find his mother asleep in a separate apartment in the rear of the house. She tells police that her and her son had dinner around 6 or 6:30 p.m. She believes she went to her apartment about 8:15 p.m. that night and didn't see William again. Police also talk with a neighbor of William Dennis, who said they saw him at 6:30 p.m. when he came by to give him some misdelivered mail. The neighbor said that William had told him that he was going to a Halloween party that night. While searching the premises, they find William Dennis's vehicle parked in his driveway. Even though it's about 2 a.m. at the time, police feel the hood and say that it still feels warm. The entire vehicle, I actually think it's a truck, is very dirty and dusty, but the driver's side door and window are wiped down. Inside the vehicle, there was blood on the ignition switch, a radio knob, on a rope in the trunk, on the steering column, and also on the headrest, the driver's seat, and finally on a mat under the gas pedal. Detectives also find another trail of blood about 100 yards west of William Dennis's house. This trail led to the driveway and also met up with the second trail of blood near a garage. Next to the garage was an empty garbage can, and on the can was a ball of blood-stained fibers. At 2:30 a.m., William Dennis is taken down to the police station. He's read his rights and he's under arrest. William waives his rights and gives a taped interview with the police. During the interview, he maintains his innocence and tells police that he left from work at 4 p.m. and went home, where he stayed the entire night. Like his mother, he says he had dinner with her and only left the house once to look around outside. He wanted to check things out because they hadn't had very many trick-or-treaters. Police then asked William Dennis about all of his Halloween costumes throughout the years. He listed several, but never mentioned the wolf costume or mask they found. While searching his house, a week later, police find a picture of William Dennis just a year earlier at a Halloween party. He was wearing the same wolf mask they found at Doreen Erbert's home, as well as matching hands that went with the costume. The assumption is that it was his wolf mask at the house, but they search his home for it nonetheless and never find this particular costume.
With this picture, he's wearing the mask and the hands. Is it definitely him wearing it? I'm just wondering, because you look at a picture, you have a mask on and these wolf hands. The picture, was it a certain clothes that he was wearing besides that they found, that they knew that it's him? Was it just the height, the build?
I don't know how they know that it's him. If you watched the Unmasked episode, there's a little bit different story about how they find a picture. They actually go through a thing with all his numbers of his friends.
Like
and
an
they find
address book?
Yeah, and they find a friend who has the picture, and she's in it as well, and she says that's him.
Oh, okay. That makes sense then.
And I don't know if he later, when is shown the picture, he identifies himself as well. I'm not sure about that. Police also inquire about the cuts on his hand. According to William Dennis, he had cut his hand when he tossed a kitchen knife in the air and accidentally caught it by the blade. When asked if after he cut himself with the knife, he had gone into the garage, he couldn't remember if he had or not. When asked about Doreen, William Dennis maintained that he hadn't walked near Doreen's house or the pedestrian bridge near her home. I should note here that people also called the police to let them know that they saw a man wearing a wolf costume, mask, etc. around the same area that same night. However, this mask described by these callers indicated that was more of a serious mask, not the cartoony one worn by Doreen's murderer and by William Dennis at the Halloween party a year earlier. Police keep William Dennis under arrest, but send him to Santa Clara Valley Medical Center to get his hands looked at and stitched up. While there, he stayed at the hospital's lockup ward. According to police, William Dennis continued to talk with him willingly throughout the night. He only stopped when police tried to ask him about a possible motive for killing Doreen. It was then that William Dennis asked for a lawyer. On November 1st, 1984, an autopsy was performed on Doreen, and the medical examiner determines that she was most likely murdered with a sword-like instrument such as a hatchet or a machete. A weapon was never found. However, police did find a label off of a Stanley 18-inch machete, as well as a sheath for a machete at William Dennis's house. They also find a receipt from the Milpitas Builders Emporium, which was a hardware store in Milpitas, a town north of San Jose and also part of Silicon Valley.
The Builders Emporium was a set of stores in California during this time. Most of them were in Southern California, but they were a California-only thing. We'll link some commercials from that time because they're always amazing. The entire chain went out of business in 1993, but we always like to tell you about unique California chains or things that you could only see in California, and this is one of them. There are apparently some stores with this name now, mainly in the Bay Area, but we couldn't find pictures even on their Facebook page. Builders Emporiums were a do-it-yourself store, not unlike our Home Depots and Lowe's or even Ace Hardwares, but they suffered a lot when larger chains showed up en masse in the 1980s and 90s.
Police purchased the exact model machete. They checked to see if it fits in the grooves that were created in the Herbart ceiling by the weapon the murderer used. It fits perfectly. They enter it into evidence as an example of what they believe William Dennis used during their murder. And from that night on, they believe William Dennis is their only real suspect. While this is all happening, Deanna Herbart is placed with friends and family. It seems her father had a difficult time dealing with this, which is understandable. She starts receiving counseling. On November 5th, 1984, William Dennis is suddenly released from custody. According to police, they don't have enough evidence to hold him and take the case to trial. The press had been covering this case all over the country, and the details are so horrific, so when he's released, people are confused and angry. To family and friends, this is scary and really hard to understand, and even in the articles I read, police seem frustrated by it. But police make a point to say that he's the only person under investigation and that they're sure they have the right person. And as frustrating as I'm sure it is to have to let William Dennis go for lack of evidence, I can understand that they need to do this. Unfortunately, it can take some time to get back tests, and they can't hold him indefinitely. Also, Deanna Herbart didn't pick him out of a lineup. She saw a man in a mask, so really what could she identify? And again, she's just a child, and she's been through a traumatic event, so it's understandable. And honestly, this is a lot of pressure for a child who's just been through all of this. On his way out of jail, William Dennis is interviewed by a journalist. He says, quote, "I didn't do it. I hope they catch the person who did. I'm not the one who did it." Letting him go would be really deflating, but in a turn of events on November 6, 1984, just the next day, William Dennis is rearrested. According to the district attorney, they get new evidence, something he calls, quote, breakthrough evidence, when some of the tests that were being run come back. The biggest is a lab analysis on blood evidence collected at William Dennis's home. According to the results, some of the blood in William Dennis's garage matched Doreen, and everything I read said matched, used that word, without any detail. And I think they might be talking about blood type matching, because DNA technology is on its way in the later 1980s, but not in 1984.
You know, after all that, they release him, and then they rearrest him, and then they say match. Like, I'm just wondering how we see nowadays on social media the outpouring, petitions, everything, like right away. You were saying this is a national case. You could have every news broadcast interviewing people who are just really mad that they released him, and it might have put a lot of pressure on the district attorney, the police, and everything like that. So they use like terms like matched and everything and just rearrest him so to save face, maybe, or something like that.
It also could be the idea of what pressure they are under to do it correctly as well. That unless they have the proverbial smoking gun of an actual blood type match or irrefutable evidence that this person, I can see not wanting to go through to arrest them and then just because they've already done that once. Mm-hmm. You know, they detained Charles under the idea that he was it, and then eventually let him go because he had nothing to do with it.
When I say national, I mean that it's picked up by papers. I don't think it's really what we think of now, where like people are outside the home. I'm not entirely sure that that's what's happening. But I do know that when they let him go, police are very frustrated with this as well because they believe he's dangerous and they don't want him on the streets. And I think because of that, they kind of make a lot of phone calls and amp the pressure up to labs to get some of this stuff done a little bit quicker than they might have done before.
They were probably maybe just hoping that it was done before they would have to release him.
Yeah, I mean, you hope that some of that stuff goes quickly, but it doesn't really always.
Well, then, and them speaking to that and saying, we're letting him go, but he is the only person that we're looking at. I can imagine that might assuage some public fears too, especially in the area that he's going back to.
Right.
But it had to be scary for the family.
Oh my God, yeah.
So I think they put some pressure to get some of these tests done quicker so that they can rearrest him. And also it's important to note that it's important that people be aware of investigations going on and how attention to that can, I don't know, get things done a little bit quicker.
Right. And that again, to the end, that once we arrest this person, that person is going to go to trial, and at trial, it has to be done correctly in order to make sure that this person is punished for the crime that he committed.
Yeah, this is not someone you want to get back out.
No.
Later in November, William Dennis is arraigned and pleads not guilty. In December of 1984, a preliminary hearing is held to determine if there's enough evidence to try William Dennis for the murders of Doreen Erbert and the fetus she was carrying. During this hearing, the district attorney presented evidence that William Dennis had been plotting the murder of both Doreen and her husband for some time. Friends of William testified that he was very angry and bitter over their divorce and the death of his son. He tells several people, including his lawyer, that he was fantasizing about drowning Doreen and Charles in the ocean to avenge Paul's death. At his home, police find 2 coffin-like boxes, 2 70-inch cloth body bags, and 2 sea anchors and maps, and information on the San Francisco Bay, which was used as evidence that he had been plotting for some time. Interestingly, the coffins were built to different sizes, and they happened to be the height of Charles and Doreen. If you remember, Doreen is shorter than 5 feet tall, so one of the coffins was very noticeably short. In April of 1985, the judge in the preliminary hearing decided there was enough evidence to charge William with the murder and go to trial.
So do you think he wasn't watching the house? He didn't know that Charles had left? Because he was all about also killing Charles. I'm just wondering, like, if he was watching the house or not and saw Charles leave and then decided to go in.
I'm not sure. Witnesses say that he was standing outside, so in one respect, I think he probably did see him leave. He will say later that he didn't know if Charles was there or not, and that he knew as he was doing this, Charles could have killed him if he had been there, but he didn't really think about that. So I'm not really sure what was running through his mind. The trial is meant to start in May, but doesn't actually occur until 1988. William Dennis is charged with murder of Doreen and her fetus. In order to qualify for the death penalty, the crime has to fulfill one of the special circumstances. In this case, William Dennis is found guilty of both murders, then he will be eligible for the death penalty, which leads us to a couple things we should talk about. The first is a right to a speedy trial. In California, charges such as these, a 3-year wait, is not uncommon. The time between arrest and trial will vary, of course, by county. For a felony like murder, arraignment has to happen within 10 days of being arrested. After this, trial can start within 60 days, and in fact, in this case, after the preliminary hearing, the judge scheduled a trial start of May 1985. However, defendants can waive their right to a speedy trial to give their lawyers time to build a defense.
It's interesting that if you charge somebody with murder, as a prosecutor, you really need to be ready to go to trial right away, where the defense can stall for longer, but you have to have your entire case ready to go as the DA.
Yeah, I mean, we should say we're not lawyers, so this is what I found researching. So yeah, that interested me as well, because that's what it seems like. Trial begins in 1988, and the first witness to testify is Deanna Herbart. She is now 8 years old. She's quite rightly afraid. She still has the voice of the man who murdered her mother in her head, threatening her life. The judge has Michael Dennis put his head down, so it would be less intimidating. But again, this is so much to ask of a child who's been through something so traumatic.
I think it's just horrible. He's still in the room. Can you ask him to leave? Do you know?
I think they probably would have if that was a possibility.
Okay. Just putting your head down, that doesn't...
How does that affect the idea of facing your accuser? Well, I guess she's not an accuser.
But she's also a child.
No, I 100% understand. I think that's where what's right sometimes conflicts with the rules of law.
This trial is a little different than others we've covered. When the trial starts, William Michael Dennis pleaded not guilty, but a few days into it, he changes his plea, or really his defense. His defense is now that he admits to committing the murder of Doreen Erbert, but that he did so because of a mental illness. Thus, the argument becomes not about whether he did or did not commit the crime, but what kind of murder it was. His main defense was that the murders resulted from a mental illness and were not premeditated or deliberate. So instead of finding guilt or innocence, the jury is tasked with determining whether or not the murder was premeditated, as the prosecutor describes, or voluntary manslaughter, because William Dennis was suffering from a mental illness, had become delusional or distraught. The defense also presented a case that William Dennis had no idea at the time of the murder that Doreen Erbert was pregnant. So let's just take these basic questions one at a time. To give you an idea of what William Michael Dennis could have been charged with, sort of a basic definition of the murders. First-degree murder, which is what the prosecution is saying he's guilty of, is a murder that is premeditated with malice of forethought, which means the person has an intent to kill. Second-degree murder is defined as a murder with no premeditation, but with malice of forethought and an understanding of your actions. Voluntary manslaughter is a murder with malice of forethought, but without a full understanding of your actions. Thus, you have less culpability. And finally, involuntary manslaughter, which doesn't really occur here, but is a murder that has no premeditation, no malice of forethought, but your actions were so irresponsible to a degree that you caused the murder.
So then, an example of first-degree murder would be, I plan the murder of someone, say my neighbor. I carry it out. I kill him. I know it's wrong. I do it anyway with planning ahead of time.
Right. It's considered the worst kind of murder.
And then second degree would be that you did it, but you didn't plan it. It just kind of happened, like in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, it could be the heat of the moment, depending on what that means legally. If you have passion, for instance, can often lower the charge to involuntary manslaughter. But in this instance, if you kill someone and you also kill somebody else, if you walk into a building and you're there to shoot a particular person, but then you also happen to shoot other people, you were there, you had an intent to kill, you could be second-degree murder. Does that make sense?
But first degree for the whole reason you were going to kill someone in the first place.
Right. So that person's murder might be first degree, and then the other murders you committed might be second degree. It sort of depends on the jury and the prosecutor. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into this. It's just the basic definitions.
And then voluntary manslaughter is... I think that's the part that I get confused on. It's with malice of forethought, which means I'm thinking about killing you, or I'd like to kill you, but I'm not clear of my actions, or...
Right. So if what seems clear in this case, for instance, is that William Michael Dennis acted, he meant to kill Doreen. But if he also had a mental illness, he didn't have a full understanding of what he was doing. So he's less culpable of the crime.
So more emotion, less thought.
Right. The passion comes into that.
Okay.
It just sort of depends, and it's up to a jury to decide. We'll go over that in a second.
And then involuntary is like a lot of times like drunk driving, right?
Yeah. Or, for instance, if a coach or a parent were to work their child's, regular daily activities, and that kid maybe doesn't eat or drink enough, and then they pass away or they die, you can be held responsible for that. You didn't have the intent to harm the child or to kill them, but your actions led to that.
Okay.
So let's take the argument of premeditation first, because it's an essential question in this trial. Whether or not William Michael Dennis had been planning to kill the family, and whether he went there that night of Halloween to do so. His defense is that he had no intention of killing Doreen when he went to her house, but became overwhelmed by his anger and sadness, seeing other kids trick-or-treating and thinking about his son Paul, that he acted without thought. To back this up, William Michael Dennis said that he didn't remember much of the murder and that he didn't see colors while he committed it. Not seeing color is a common effect during blind rage. The prosecution presents evidence he had been planning the murders of both Doreen and Charles, and not just by drowning, which we talked about earlier. They showed the jury that handmade boxes, the bags and anchors they found. He had told various people that he had bought the machete with Doreen in mind about a month or so before the murder happened. To negate the rage theory, the prosecutor also presented one of the conversations that William Michael Dennis had with police, in which he described parts of the attack in color, including what Doreen was wearing. The meatiest part of Dennis's defense, though, is that he wasn't responsible for his actions because of a mental illness. And remember, a mental illness is an affirmative defense, so it's up to the defense to prove and the jury to decide on. Key to proving this is that your mental illness made you, 1, incapable of understanding the nature of the criminal act, and 2, incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong. And just a little fun fact, insanity is a common defense I know in movies and TV, but it isn't often used in court. And one statistic I found said that less than 1% of defendants use this nationwide. And it's a relatively new defense in America. It was only passed by California voters in 1982, but it does have a history that goes back to a British case from 1843. The defense will say he had a mental illness. From what I can tell, he sees a few psychologists and psychiatrists. They don't all agree, and actually only one testifies. He doesn't testify that William Michael Dennis was insane, and says the defense never asked him to, but he does say that if they had, he would have testified that he was. He noted that William Michael Dennis had so much rage he was a, quote, ticking time bomb. He believes Dennis has depressive disorder and suffered delusional thoughts. After his son died, he blamed himself, then transferred that blame to Doreen and Charles, and came to believe that she intentionally murdered their son, and even that his lawyer representing him at trial wanted to kill him. His anger made him unable to fully comprehend his actions. The doctor also testified that he did not believe the fantasy William Dennis had of drowning Doreen and Charles was one he intended to fulfill. The prosecution says that all the times William Michael Dennis talked with police or psychiatrists show that he was conscious of his guilt. His actions during the crime, concealing his footprints, wearing gloves, hiding the weapon, etc., is evidence that he was aware he was doing something wrong. On top of finding the coffins and bags at his house, the police also found a Penthouse magazine at his house from 1982 with the article titled, quote, The Farce of Courtroom Psychiatry, Murder by Insanity. He'd also been leaving Doreen threatening phone calls saying, I'm going to kill you, so he'd been thinking about this for some time.
The magazine thing, did it say that they found a stack of Penthouse magazines, or did they just find that one?
I believe he had others. I'm not totally sure, but it wasn't mixed in. It was directly on top of his stuff, and it was from several years prior.
So he'd already been it, like he's planning his defense before he ever does anything.
That's what they believe, yes. The last thing the jury had to decide in this case was whether or not he was responsible for the death of the fetus. The law in California was amended in the 1970s to include the word fetus. The specific statute for murder says, quote, Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being or a fetus with malice aforethought. During this trial, it became important whether or not he knew that she was pregnant. If he did, then he had intent to kill the fetus. If he didn't, then it's a lesser charge, or it was at the time. And I'll note here that in 2002, the California Supreme Court cleared this question up when they decided that a man who had killed his girlfriend was responsible for the death of her fetus, even though he had no idea she was pregnant. William Michael Dennis's defense says he didn't know, and I believe he maintains that to this day, that he didn't know that Doreen was pregnant. The prosecution presents evidence that he did, including that his stepmother knew that Doreen was pregnant as she had still been friends with her. The prosecution presents evidence that he did, including his stepmother, who was friends with Doreen and knew about the pregnancy. A co-worker also testified that William Michael Dennis told her that Doreen was, quote, pregnant again. And then you have several people who say he watched the house from across the street for some time. And this is the part where her being very visibly pregnant comes in. So if he was watching her, people say he must have known. So those are the three basic questions the jury had to grapple with. On August 16, 1988, a jury of 10 men and 2 women come back with a verdict for William Dennis. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Doreen Erbert and guilty of second-degree murder in the death of baby boy Herbart. The penalty phase started, and the jury was given the choice of the death penalty or life without parole. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and recommended the death penalty. Judge John Schatz sentenced William Michael Dennis to death by the gas chamber. After his sentencing, William Michael Dennis addressed the court. He spoke for about 30 minutes. He blamed Doreen for his actions and for the death of his son. He accused her of cheating on him while they were married and presented 3 reports that the fence around her pool had been faulty. He never apologized for the murders, which I can't imagine sitting in the courtroom as her family and having to listen to this.
Right. I just think anyone having to listen to this, I don't know. It's just hard to, I wouldn't be able to listen to that after that trial of everything. And then.
And the amount of forensic evidence that was shown at the trial and the details of it. And then, I mean, I know it's his right, but, and then to be the husband and daughter of the victim.
And the paper did highlight several people who I guess often go to trials. That's what I think they were retired and they do that. And they talked about how this trial in particular made them, some of them physically ill, having to listen to the details. After William Michael Dennis is sentenced to death, an automatic appeals process starts for him. This initial process can take many years. And just a quick overview to understand how it works in California. When you get a death sentence, the state Supreme Court automatically reviews your case. This alone can take up to 9 years. And one of the reasons is that you're generally assigned a public defender to represent you. And that idea that a public defender is overworked is a real one. And this part, just getting a lawyer, can take 3 to 5 years. Then your lawyer needs time to research your case, go over what happened, maybe even investigate new things. They also have to write and file briefs, investigate other cases, the law, just a lot of work. And it can take around 4 years to do so. A ruling can also take years, and this is really the beginning of the appeals process. There are state appeals, federal appeals, and the average it takes to exhaust all of it in California is about 25 years. William Michael Dennis is currently on death row and in the middle of this process. He maintains that he should have been convicted of manslaughter. But we should note that on top of the appeals process that he's not currently undertaking, California has put the death penalty on hold. We haven't put anyone to death since 2006. There are several court cases that have to be decided and protocols that California has to create before it's started again. And on top of this, nothing in California is forever, specifically laws, and that's mainly because of the voters. Issues with the death penalty have been on the California ballot many times and in fact have been outlawed. We outlawed it once in the 70s before it came back. In 2016, there were 2 ballot measures about the death penalty. And in fact, the Herbart family spoke out about both of them, which is a lot to deal with, I think, having to go through trial and then you're also dealing with this constant back and forth with the law. The first proposition was Proposition 66, and it had many things in it, but its main goal was to shorten the appeals process to a maximum of 5 years. The Herberts were in favor of this and believed it was a fundamental to protecting victims' rights, just because it's so emotional to have to keep going over it, to spend that 25 years, and there's always the chance, William Michael Dennis might get out. Proposition 66 passed, but there were court cases filed against it immediately, and ultimately, an appeals court said that the part of the law stating the appeals process should be wrapped up in 5 years would be suggestive, not directive. Ultimately, wanting to have this process wrapped up as quickly as possible is not more important than doing it effectively.
So the spirit of the law then is try to get it done as fast as possible with an eye on the 5 years, but it's not a directive saying you have to.
Right. And this particular proposition also didn't have any added money or any solutions to what is already a long process for several reasons, one of them being not enough public defenders.
So in that respect, then, it's saying, yeah, we'd like this done, but we're not willing to put any money or come up with a solution. Just fix the problem? Is that it?
I don't know that they weren't willing. Whoever wrote the proposition, it wasn't included. So
Okay.
It didn't have those measures. So my guess is things will stay the kind of length that they are, for now at least. The other proposition that year was Prop 62 and would have ended the death penalty in California. The Herbart family also spoke out against this, as did many families. And actually, William Michael Dennis was also interviewed about this proposition from death row, as were many other people on death row. And their opinions about ending it were varied. He was against the death penalty and believed his appeals will change his sentence, but at the same time thought if someone were to give him the option of dying at that moment, he would take it. Prop 62 failed, with 53% voting in favor of keeping the death penalty and 46% voting to get rid of it, which is to say that this is probably an issue that will come up on the ballot again. So the Herberts will still have to endure so much, the appeals process, and probably in the future, again, standing up for the death penalty in California, if it ever gets restarted again. Halloween in 1984 should have been a happy time for the Herbart family. spending the night with their little girl and excited about welcoming a new baby boy into their family. William Michael Dennis had other plans, and his choices that night left many victims, including Doreen and her little boy, Deanna, who had to suffer the attack and live without her mother and brother, and Charles Herbart, who had to live his life without his wife and son. This case is a terrible reminder of what a few short minutes can do to an entire family, and how our justice system can still, after many years, take a toll on victims. I want to thank Charles and Sean for joining me for this episode. You guys have any last words?
No, this is another example of a case that I had never heard of, I had no idea about until you started doing your research, and now it's become a story that I don't think I will forget anytime soon.
It's interesting with these cases because we do all the research and we learn about the laws and everything like that, and we're learning about laws that I feel like I'm more confused about law. It's kind of like the whole Constitution reading of using it as a living document. Even with these laws that are supposed to be in place, people are able to kind of twist them how they want to, and then a jury decides after that. And it's just really hard to get a grasp on all of it.
Yeah, I think you're trying to put laws around something that's hard to understand and is complicated. And sometimes when I was looking at it, deciding what's a person or if someone meant to do something, it sometimes just never feels like enough.
And I think that's the interesting thing, because when all said and done, it's a group of people that are making that ultimate judgment, that come from different backgrounds, that have different areas of expertise and different knowledge, but then they're called upon in such a serious manner to make this judgment on the facts that are presented to them with no background. You know, most of them don't have a background in criminal law. Most of them don't have a background in the expertise that are being given to them. It's amazing sometimes. Before we go, we want to draw attention to a cold case in San Jose that there was very little detail about. On October 12th, 1974, a woman named Doreen St. Germain was found deceased in San Jose on 11th Street and Horning at 10:30 p.m. Doreen was a 16-year-old runaway from Connecticut. She'd been living in Monterey and was last seen the night of the 12th in Pacific Grove. There is an open cold case on her murder. We will put her picture up on our social media, and if you have any information about the murder of Doreen St. Germain, you can submit a tip to the San Jose Police Department on their website, which we will be posting a link on CaliforniaTrueCrime.com, as well as our social media.
Thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. You can always contact us on our Twitter or Instagram, which is @CaliTrueCrime. Check out our Facebook page or even join our Facebook group. And if you would like to, please leave us a review. We would like to thank our quality control engineer, Melanie Duncan. This was recorded and produced at Chateau Walnut.